The forgotten town that still whispers. The legend of Hollow Creek. In the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, nestled deep within the thick forests, there existed a town that no map could find. It was a place forgotten by time itself, a town so shrouded in mystery that even the bravest of souls who ventured near it would leave with stories they dared not speak aloud. Hollow Creek, they called it, though no one knew how the name came to be. No one, that is, except for the people who had lived there, and they were long gone. The town had once been a lively place, filled with families who had settled in the fertile land, and its people had lived simple, hard-working lives. But something happened there, something that twisted the very air around Hollow Creek. No one had the full story. It was whispered that the townsfolk had made a pact, one that was never meant to be broken. Some say it was a pact with the land, others with the spirits that roamed the woods. Whatever it was, it changed them and the town with it. It was late autumn when Jonah, a young historian from the city, first heard of the town's eerie past. He had been working on a project to uncover forgotten histories, and Hollow Creek's name had come up more than once in his research. Curiosity gnawed at him, pulling him toward the remote town. He thought it was just another faded legend, a tale spun around a campfire to frighten children. But there was something different about Hollow Creek. It beckoned him as if the town knew he would come. Jonah set off with little more than a map, a compass and a camera. His journey took him deep into the mountains, past rivers that ran cold and dark, and through forests that grew thicker with each step. He had heard the warnings, the mutterings of locals in nearby towns about the forgotten town. "Don't go near Hollow Creek," they said. "It's cursed. There are things in that town, things that you don't want to meet." But Jonah, like many before him, believed he was different. He was a man of logic, of reason. Folklore and superstition were nothing more than stories told by the old and the frightened. As Jonah approached the clearing where the town was said to be, an eerie silence fell over the forest. The wind, which had been rustling through the trees only moments before, died down, leaving behind an unnatural stillness. His heart pounded as he stepped forward, each footfall muffled by the thick carpet of fallen leaves. The feeling of being watched settled over him, but he pushed it aside. This was it. Hollow Creek. Jonah paused as he reached the edge of the town. The air felt heavy, almost as if the very earth beneath his feet was pressing down on him. He looked around and saw nothing but crumbling houses and overgrown streets. The buildings, once vibrant with life, were now little more than skeletons of wood and stone, sagging under the weight of time and neglect. It was as if the town had been abandoned in a hurry, with no one left to finish the task. No signs of life remained, only the remnants of a forgotten past. He pulled out his camera and began to snap pictures of the ruins, each frame capturing a piece of the town's forgotten history. But as he moved deeper into Hollow Creek, something strange began to happen. The air grew colder. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, and the silence, once so soothing, began to feel oppressive, suffocating even. Jonah came across a house that stood slightly apart from the others. It was in better condition than the rest, though still worn by age. Its door was slightly ajar, as if inviting him in. Against his better judgment, he stepped inside. The floor creaked under his weight, and the scent of dust and decay filled his nostrils. The house felt alive, as if it was waiting for him. In the center of the room stood an old wooden rocking chair. It moved ever so slightly, as if stirred by an unseen hand. Jonah's breath caught in his throat. He had heard the stories of Hollow Creek, of strange happenings, of whispers in the dark, of spirits that refused to rest, but he had dismissed them as fanciful tales. Now, in the heart of the forgotten town, those stories seemed all too real. As he ventured further into the house, he noticed something odd. On the walls were strange symbols, etched deep into the wood, and there, in the far corner of the room, was a faded painting of the town itself. It was an older painting, long before the houses had fallen into ruin, and it showed a vibrant town with people walking the streets, laughing and talking. But in the center of the town, in front of the town hall, was a figure, unmistakable in its eerie presence. It was a woman, her face pale and her eyes wide as if in terror. The figure seemed out of place, standing apart from the others. Jonah leaned in closer, and his eyes widened in horror as he realized the woman's face was not a painting at all, but a reflection in the glass. She was staring back at him. Jonah recoiled, his heart racing. He backed away slowly, his mind reeling. The house, the town, it was all wrong. There was something here, something that lingered, something that had never left. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind him. He spun around, his pulse pounding in his ears, but no one was there. The air was thick, heavy with an energy he couldn't explain. And then the whispers began. At first, It was just a faint murmur, barely audible over the sound of his own breathing. But it grew louder, closer. It was as if the town itself was speaking, urging him to leave, to get out before it was too late. Jonah's legs felt like lead, but he forced himself to move, stumbling toward the door. The whispers followed him, echoing in his mind. He reached the door, but it wouldn't budge. His heart thudded painfully in his chest as he tugged at the handle, desperate to escape. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. He felt the cold hands of the past closing in around him. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the door swung open, spilling light into the room. Jonah didn't hesitate. He ran. He didn't stop until he was back at the edge of Hollow Creek, panting and terrified. He looked back once, but the town was gone. It was as if the forest had swallowed it whole, erasing it from the earth. Jonah couldn't explain what had happened, but one thing was certain. Hollow Creek wasn't a place for the living. That night, as Jonah lay in his tent, trying to shake the images from his mind, the wind began to pick up. It howled through the trees, sending shivers down his spine. And through the wind, he heard it, the unmistakable sound of a woman's voice, whispering his name. The forgotten town had left its mark on him, and no matter how far he ran, its whispers would never fade. The call of the forgotten. The days following Jonah's escape from Hollow Creek were long and restless. He tried to convince himself that it was just a figment of his imagination, that the stories of Hollow Creek were nothing more than exaggerated whispers from a superstitious town. But the whispers, the ones he couldn't shake, followed him wherever he went. He returned to the city, his mind weighed down by the memories of the town, the chilling painting and the spectral woman. His nights were plagued with dreams of the forgotten town, dreams of the cold, lifeless streets, and the eerie figure watching him from the shadows. The voice that whispered his name in the wind still echoed in his mind, a constant reminder of the town that wouldn't let go. Jonah tried to focus on his work, but it was impossible to ignore the nagging feeling that something was missing, something he had left behind in Hollow Creek. There was a pull, an inexplicable force that called to him, urging him to return. It wasn't long before Jonah found himself standing at the edge of the forest once more, the same eerie silence greeting him as he crossed the threshold. The wind no longer carried the whispers of Hollow Creek. Instead, it felt as if the forest itself held its breath, waiting for something to happen. Jonah could feel the weight of it in the air, as if the trees themselves were watching him. The ground beneath his feet felt different now, more familiar yet infinitely more dangerous. The path he had taken before was no longer visible. The clearing where Hollow Creek had once stood was obscured by dense undergrowth, as if the town had been swallowed whole by the forest, hidden away from the eyes of the world. Jonah had no map now, no compass. He was guided by something else, something that drew him deeper into the woods. He walked for what seemed like hours, the dense trees and thick underbrush closing in around him. But even as the world seemed to grow darker and more oppressive, he didn't feel lost. He knew where he was going. He could feel it in his bones, the pull that beckoned him to the forgotten town. And then, just as his resolve began to falter, he saw it, a clearing. There, just beyond the trees, the ruins of Hollow Creek stood as if untouched by time. The buildings loomed like specters, their broken walls and sagging roofs barely holding onto the earth. The air was thick with the same oppressive stillness Jonah had felt before. But now it felt different, more urgent, as though the town itself was alive, watching him, waiting. Jonah hesitated, his breath catching in his throat. The voice, the whispers, they were louder now. He could hear them even without trying, calling to him from every direction, urging him to step forward, to come closer. It was the same woman's voice, the one he had heard in the wind that night. But now it was clearer, more insistent. "Jonah," it whispered, "you've come back. You must know the truth." His heart raced as he stepped forward, his feet moving on their own accord, drawn by the voice. He knew he should turn back, that something terrible awaited him in Hollow Creek, but he couldn't stop himself. He had to know. He entered the town again, this time with a sense of dread that hung over him like a dark cloud. The buildings loomed around him, their rotting facades casting long shadows that seemed to move with him. The air grew colder with each step, and the silence pressed in on him from all sides, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Jonah made his way to the house with the rocking chair, the one he had seen before. It stood in the same place as though waiting for him. This time, however, the door was wide open, inviting him inside. He didn't think, he just walked through it, his heart pounding in his chest. The house was just as he remembered it, but now, there was a new presence here, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The rocking chair sat still, its motion gone. The symbols on the walls seemed to shimmer in the dim light, their meaning still unknown. And there, in the corner, was the painting. Only now the woman in the portrait was different. Her face was no longer merely an eerie reflection. It was as though she had stepped out of the canvas, her eyes locked onto Jonah's with a look of pleading desperation. "Help me," the woman whispered, her voice now unmistakable. "You must undo what was done." Jonah's breath caught in his throat. He didn't understand. He had heard the stories, but this was something beyond anything he had imagined. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. The pact, the strange symbols, the woman who haunted the town, it was all connected somehow. But how? What had happened in Hollow Creek to curse it so? Suddenly the room grew colder. A chill swept over Jonah, seeping into his bones. The shadows in the corners of the room twisted and writhed, as though they had a life of their own. And then from the darkness a figure emerged, a tall, gaunt man dressed in tattered clothing, his face hidden in the shadows. The woman's whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if she were trying to warn Jonah. The man stepped forward, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "You should not have returned," he said, his voice a low, rumbling growl. "The town is not what it seems. It never was." Jonah's heart raced as the man reached out, his cold fingers brushing against Jonah's arm. The moment their skin touched, a wave of cold and darkness flooded Jonah's mind, visions flashing before his eyes. He saw the townsfolk, faces twisted in fear, their eyes wide with terror. He saw the woman standing in front of the town hall, pleading for her life as the others turned away, abandoning her to whatever curse had befallen them. And then, just as suddenly as the vision had come, it faded. Jonah stumbled backward, his mind reeling. He knew what had to be done. The town's pact had to be broken. The curse that had bound Hollow Creek for so long could only be lifted by the truth that had been hidden for generations. But as he turned to leave, the door slammed shut. The whispers grew louder, and the woman's voice cried out one last time. "Jonah, you cannot leave. The town will never let you go." And with those words the shadows closed in. The reckoning of Hollow Creek. Jonah's breath came in short, ragged gasps as the walls of the house seemed to close in around him. The oppressive silence of Hollow Creek was shattered by the deafening sound of whispers, all speaking at once. It was as if the very air had turned against him, and the spirits of the town were now awake, clamoring for his attention. The woman's voice, so familiar, so haunting, echoed through his skull. "Jonah. Jonah." He couldn't think. The room spun, and his vision blurred as the shadows seemed to gather in the corners, creeping toward him like a living entity. He stumbled back, his legs weak, but it was no use. The man, the figure in the shadows, was upon him now. He reached out, grasping Jonah's wrist with icy fingers, and a cold wave of energy pulsed through Jonah's body. His muscles stiffened, and for a brief moment he felt as though his very soul was being pulled away from him, leaving him a hollow shell. "You don't understand," the man's voice rumbled, so deep it felt like a tremor in the ground beneath him. "The curse is not of this world. It was forged by the land itself, by the blood of those who lived here." Jonah's thoughts swirled. His heart pounded against his chest as he struggled to break free from the grip of the man. The whispers intensified, and his mind raced back to the vision he had seen. The townsfolk abandoning the woman, her desperate pleas ignored by those who had once been her friends, her family. She had been left to face whatever curse had befallen Hollow Creek alone. And then it hit him, the truth. The woman's sacrifice, the pact made by the townspeople, it was not a simple deal. It was a blood sacrifice, made to protect the town from something far older, far more dangerous than any of them could have known. Hollow Creek had been cursed long before the townsfolk had arrived. The land itself had carried the curse, an ancient darkness that had festered beneath the earth for centuries. The townspeople's pact had been made to contain that darkness. But in doing so they had trapped themselves, bound their souls to the land. And now the woman, her face forever etched in the painting, was the key. She had been the one chosen to bear the brunt of the curse. But when the pact had been broken by the betrayal of her fellow townsfolk, the curse had not just claimed her, it had claimed them all. Jonah gasped, breaking free from the man's grasp. The shadows recoiled, and for a moment the room seemed to still. He realized now that the man was not human, not truly. He was a manifestation of the town's suffering, a product of the pact, the lingering spirit of someone long dead, caught between worlds. The whispers quieted, and in the eerie silence Jonah turned to the woman in the painting. Her eyes, those haunting eyes, stared back at him. She looked so real, as though she might step right out of the frame and into the room. But there was something else in her gaze now, something different. It was a look of understanding. Jonah stepped toward the painting, feeling the cold pull of the town's history, the weight of the years upon him. He had come to uncover the truth, but now he realized that the truth had always been here, buried beneath layers of grief, regret, and forgotten promises. And it was this truth that held the key to breaking the curse. "The town is doomed," Jonah whispered, more to himself than anyone else. "It will always be forgotten. It will always call to the living, trying to trap them here." The woman's face softened, a faint smile curling her lips. She seemed to acknowledge his words as though she had waited for someone, anyone, to finally understand. "But there is a way," Jonah continued, his voice growing stronger. "A way to end it." He turned to the shadowed figure that still loomed in the doorway. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, burning with fury. "You must leave," Jonah said, his voice shaking with determination. "The pact must end. The curse must break." The figure's laughter was low and hollow, echoing throughout the room. "You think you can end it?" it snarled. "The town has lived for centuries, feeding on the souls of the curious, the foolish. There is no escape from Hollow Creek. Not for you. Not for anyone." Jonah's heart raced, but he felt a surge of clarity. The whispers, the figure, the woman, they were all part of the same story. He had to face the town's darkness head-on. If he was to survive, if he was to break the curse, he had to sever the tie that bound the spirits to this place, to the land itself. Jonah turned and looked at the house, its cracked walls, its rotting beams. The house was the heart of Hollow Creek, the place where the pact had been sealed all those years ago. And now it was where the curse would be undone. He approached the door, and as he did, the air grew colder, the whispers louder. The shadows seemed to stretch toward him, as if trying to pull him back into the darkness. But Jonah didn't stop. He reached for the door handle and turned it. The house groaned, as though it had been holding its breath for far too long. With one final, defiant step, Jonah crossed the threshold. Outside, the town seemed to shudder. The sky above Hollow Creek darkened, and the trees swayed as if caught in a storm that only they could feel. The land was angry, resentful of the truth that had been uncovered. But Jonah pressed on, his every step bringing him closer to the heart of the curse. He reached the town hall, the place where the pact had been forged so long ago. It was here Jonah knew that the curse could be broken. And it was here that the last sacrifice would be made. As he stepped inside, the air grew thick, and the shadows gathered around him. The woman's voice whispered once more, this time not in desperation, but in gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice fading as though she were slipping away into nothingness. Jonah knew that the curse was finally over. The town's darkness, its grip on the land, was broken. Hollow Creek was no more. And with it, the forgotten town would finally rest. As the last of the shadows faded, and the whispers fell silent, Jonah turned and walked out of the town. The air felt lighter now, as if a weight had been lifted from the land. The trees, the forest, everything seemed to breathe freely once again. But as Jonah disappeared into the distance, a faint whisper lingered in the wind, just on the edge of hearing. "Hollow Creek still whispers."